Too small.
Good evening. Welcome, everyone. It is such a pleasure to have you all for joining us for such an important discussion tonight. The Saudi Sustainability Talks were one of the first engagement initiatives under Eon Collective, launched just over a year ago. And while we were unable to host these talks in our preferred format in person, we are delighted to have you all with us virtually. We will try our best to mirror the experience and engagement we have during our physical gatherings, and we ask you all to help achieve this evening by engaging in an ensuing dialogue. As it is our mission under the collective, through its multiple initiatives, to enhance dialogue and harness discussions to advance cooperation and efforts towards sustainable development, the first hour will be in a webinar format, which will begin with our main speakers presenting their views with Q&A and select interventions from our online guests. We ask that you please use the chat box to send your questions to the speakers, whether it's on the website, Vimeo, YouTube, LinkedIn, or here on Zoom. If you would like to add into the discussion and present your points, we ask you to please raise your hand and we will loop you into the video discussion. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Holly Chant, our moderator for this evening. Holly recently returned to the United States after spending over 12 years in the GCC. She is currently the Director of Sustainability with the Google Lend-Lease Development Ventures in Silicon Valley, California. Prior to joining Google Ventures, she served as Director of Sustainability and Environment at the Kingdom's Giga Project, Qiddiya. Holly is delighted to be staying engaged with the Kingdom through providing built environment support as a principal consultant with Eon Strategy and also through Saudi Sustainability Talks. Holly.
Thank you, Ellen. Oh, it's so delightful to again join Saudi Sustainability Talks, and how much has happened since last September when we first met. It's really, really an incredible time in history. For me, having migrated back to the US to be closer to my family has been a really big event, and to happen during the time of COVID, really even more extraordinary. But I do have thoughts with the Kingdom every day, and because of that, I'm delighted to be invited by Eon Collective to participate again today as your moderator, as I did in the opening session last year. I'm particularly delighted to be here today because we have the privilege of having with us some really wonderful guests. And I'm very delighted to introduce first Dr. John Spengler, who is the Professor of Environmental Health and Habitation at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. Jack, as he likes to be known, is also a significant person to me because he was a professor when I did my master's degree at Harvard Extension School, and I consider him a mentor. We are equally privileged to have with us Dr. Wendy Purcell, who is a faculty research scholar in the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. And Dr. Wendy brings to the school and our discourse today a very interesting perspective on public health and sustainability, and a wonderful passion for our initiatives globally that we have towards stewardship and better public health. So I'm not going to read the full bios of our guests, but they have extraordinary careers. So I do invite you to return to the website when you have time to review them in depth. And with that, I'd like to turn over to our guests so we can enjoy their time with us. Thanks, Dr. Jack and Dr. Wendy.
Well, thank you, Holly. I think you were the facilitator to make all this happen. You connected us in many ways to your contacts, your friends throughout the Middle East in our prior research that we did on sustainable urbanism in the Gulf region. And to have us back again for this seminar series, we very much appreciate it. I understand that the slides will be advanced upon request. Is that how we're doing it? Okay, thanks, Ellen. It'd be you that will do that. So please go to the next slide. And I think this is important that we're talking about this topic, that it doesn't come out of the top level consciousness of us at this time. I mean, we can be so focused with economic conflict, political conflict around the world, COVID, pandemic issues around the world, presidential campaigns, and all the, let's say, intrigue that follows. And And we shouldn't lose sight that we have one fragile Earth. And every single day we realize how more fragile it becomes. So by way of my background, I am the Akira Yamaguchi Professor of Health, Environmental Health, and Human Habitation. My work has been on outdoor air pollution and the health effects on children and adults and long-term impacts of mortality from outdoor air pollution. Then I turned to indoor air pollution. And that got us involved with green schools. It got us, our research led us to be invited to be the editors of a major publication by McGraw-Hill on indoor air quality handbook. And currently, what you see in the upper left-hand side, right-hand side, but the image of ACRP, that is a study we did for the National Transportation Research Board of our National Academies of Sciences. And it was about infection, mitigation techniques to stop the transmission of respiratory infection in airports and airplanes. That was published 5 years ago. And how prophetic this was, that we're right back onto these topics. But I will just then say a second about my Gen Z grandkids. Here they are all together, thinking the world is going to go on just like it has in the past. And they're enjoying time together in the summertime, as cousins often do. And yet they will live deep into this century. With a little luck, they will all born in the 2000s, and they might be into their senior years by the time we're in the second third of this decade, of this century. And what world will they face? So that has me really focused on these issues. And I'm glad to share some of our thoughts of a way forward. So next slide, please. And Wendy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, thanks.
So pleased to be associated with you. Yep.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jack. And thanks to EOM Collective and to you, Holly. It's a deep pleasure to share this virtual stage with Jack and to have a chance to talk about, I think, sustainability and business and health, and look at that with you and dialogue with you. So, yeah, my background is very much a scientist. My chair outside Harvard is in biomedicine, biomedical sciences. And so all of my career has been in the sort of science and education. It's been very much around transforming lives through education and research. And that took me through, a fairly typical academic career, from kind of bench scientist up to being a dean of science, to being a provost, and then finally a president of a university. And during that time, we used very much the lenses of sustainability to look at everything we were doing as a university, and that took us into the national stage, working with the UK government around business, innovation and skills and the intersection thereof. And at the end of that, as a kind of short intervention, I came to join Jack's team for what was going to be a period of about 3 or 6 months, and that was about 5 years ago, as we keep getting deeper and deeper together into the leadership that's required really to deliver the transformation, I think, that we're going to look at together around sustainability. So that's taking me into working with higher education leaders globally, as universities lean into this space, to working with a whole suite of business sectors, from travel and tourism and sustainability leadership, through to the auto industry that we'll talk to you a little bit about, our culture of health work, into a whole suite of global leaders who are driven by purpose, framed around sustainability, profit and impact and care of the planet. And now, as Jack mentioned, working with the airline sector to think about how we regroup. So I think it's been a very interesting personal and professional journey. And I think we'll look at that together, as how these strands of sustainability and business and health come together So if I could take our next slide, please. We're using this definition really that was articulated back in 1987 by the World Commission on Environment and Development as our definition, our working definition of sustainability. And very much, I think, as Jack gave us that, very profound picture of those Gen Z grandchildren, to think about how do we meet the needs now of the present, but without compromising the ability of those future generations. And many of those future generations are here, they're here now. How do we make sure that we don't compromise their ability to meet their own needs? And we feel that's a very profound and deep way of describing sustainability. So we take that into our next slide. One of the definitions that has then been developed over the subsequent years led to the articulation of what's known as Agenda 2030, so the Sustainable Development Goals, adopted universally by the world, a suite of 17 goals. That is, in fact, I think the nearest thing we have to a global strategy. So a suite of 17 goals underpinned by 169 targets that relies on creating a world where no one is left behind. So rather than getting lost in some of the detail, I think that sense of what is this ambition collectively, globally, it's about the opportunity to create together a world where no one is left behind. And we'll revisit, I think, what are known as the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. We'll revisit that as a guiding compass, really, throughout our talk. So, Jack.
Yes, and I think you said it well, because just as companies, just as governments, and cities and towns, we've seen adopt the strategies to improve the global community through SDGs. We have too in our own research. So we have refocused our research and said, we're really contributing to equity issues, to renewable energies, to smart cities. In many ways, we really find our purpose, our individual research purpose now in these goals. So advance the next slide, please, because I want to have a perspective on that. And so this is titled The Obvious, Our Fragile Atmosphere. We should say our fragile ecosystems, but start with the atmosphere. So here we have this one ball of blue floating somewhere in the universe at the end of a spiral galaxy is our Milky Way. And we have this thin veneer of atmosphere over us that only goes up a few kilometers into the atmosphere. Above the surface of the earth. And we have now recognized that the things we put into that atmosphere that we thought was a way to disperse and dilute. We're talking about coal burning. We're talking about nuclear waste discharge into the atmosphere, incineration, trash. We thought, well, it would just go away. The next slide is a reminder of that the pollution that we put in to that atmosphere to keep our economies going, based on fossil fuel in many cases, no longer goes away. Sure, some of the pollutants get taken out in rain and some settles to the ground, but much of this emissions, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrogen oxides, fluorinated hydrocarbons that are in our air conditioning systems, in our cars, in our office buildings, have long lifetimes in the atmosphere. So I'd like to capture this by saying there's no way anymore. And some of these synthetic compounds, the brominated compounds, the chlorinated compounds, the fluorinated ones that we use both as pesticides and insecticides, also in our clothing, so it's wrinkle-free and dirt-free. We have been a genius species for making new things that never exist in nature. But the problem is some of these things are very resilient to breakdown. We made them that way so that they have persistence. And these are a set of forever chemicals. So we have a chemical burden we put upon ourselves, and we've had a greenhouse gas burden that we put upon the atmosphere. Next slide, please. So just as one tracer for this burden in the atmosphere that doesn't go away easily. In fact, if we keep the faucet turned on as full as we turn it on and have a small drain, that will continue to build up. And that's what's happened in the atmosphere. So what you're seeing on the left side here is the carbon dioxide measurements, first made as a graduate student experiment on Mauna Loa. This is an observatory high on the hillsides of one of the volcanoes on the Big Island of Hawaii. And he made these measurements, Charles Kaling made these measurements early in the late 50s, early 60s. Nobody cared about CO2 at that time. And the levels he saw were going up. They'd go up and down seasonally. That ratchet effect that you see on that graph is real. And in the Northern Hemisphere summertime, vegetation takes out CO2 and it builds up again in the winter. So that up and down thing is the seasonal cycle because Hawaii is in the Northern Hemisphere. So it's monitoring what's happening mostly in the Northern Hemisphere as well as globally because it's so remote in the middle of the Pacific Island, the Pacific Ocean. But what it turned out to be a slight increase, a part per million per year. If you look at this is not a straight line over time. This is curvilinear. So that in the last decade, the levels are going up at 3 parts per million a year. So we're now well past pre-industrial age levels, well past the early 70s. We're at almost 415 parts per million per year. And this shows the latest update. You can go online, look at NOAA, and see the increase. So we have this buildup of CO2. The implication is clear. The CO2 molecule happens to interact, it resonates with long wave radiation, infrared radiation that's leaving the Earth. And what effectively it does, it translates that radiation into heat, a real sensible heat, because that molecule starts to vibrate and rotate, and that essentially sets off a cascade of warming other molecules around it. So that atmosphere warms because of this, right? And then we have other contaminants that go into the atmosphere that have similar kind of properties to warming up the atmosphere. But this is the prime driver, the carbon dioxide. And the implication is we all know it, that you're coming from a dry region, of course, where you are in Saudi Arabia. But if you moved over along your same latitude to tropical regions, say to India, if you just move that side, now you have the moisture of the Indian Ocean, and that warm air holds a lot of water. So no wonder monsoon rainfalls are intense. So the warmer the gas is, the warmer the atmosphere is, the more moisture it holds. And so now we have 2 prime drivers of changing energy balances in that fragile atmosphere around the Earth. So you have the temperature increase of the atmosphere, and you have then the moisture flux, which becomes the engine for cyclones, which are tropical storms that end up as hurricanes or end up in typhoons. Energy driven by the moisture that's taken up into the atmosphere and condenses and releasing energy. Next slide. And I'll try to speed this up. That was a long background, but I think it was important to understand the physics here. So let's draw back and say, we're such a unique species, living beyond our ecosystems, right? We can create our own ecosystems. We build infrastructure, right? We build habitats, and other animals don't quite do that. They use their natural materials around them, and certainly they build nests and they burrow and they live within the same constructs of their climate situation. But we, as a group of individuals, are making decisions, either individually or collectively through the organizations, the companies we belong to, the governments that we participate in, the other institutes. We're making those decisions that, in effect, are borrowing against the natural resources. So we call this the natural capital. Where do you think energy primarily comes from? It comes from uranium we dig out of the ground, comes from harnessing rivers to get hydropower. It comes from the fossil fuels we dig up and burn, right? And that's what happens. So we're making these decisions to borrow from nature. In the same way you can make it with minerals, you can say the same thing with lumber, same thing with agriculture, right? So we're making decisions that affect nature without regards for them being in this balance of power. Next slide. So on to you, Wendy. Right? Wendy, are you still with us? Did we? Oh, maybe she has to rejoin. Did we lose her? Do you, Ellen, do you know, or Holly? You're on mic. So let me.
It seems like she's rejoining.
She's going to rejoin. Well,
yeah.
She was going to pick up on this, and I think, yeah, I think.
Oh, there she is.
Good, Wendy.
I'm back.
Good. So, why don't you take it from this point? You were going to talk about the big, mega trends that we now have to deal with simultaneously, right? With climate change and all these other things.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Yeah, indeed. I mean, I think, the point I wanted to make here really is that, we talk about change and we talk about, the impact of these, global mega trends. And I think people can quite rightly challenge that, change has always been around. I mean, if you look at, the Industrial Revolution, if you look at the pace of technology, if you look at the whole range of human migration and the sense of economic growth. And so there's a whole suite of technological changes as well as kind of societal changes. But I think the key difference now is are two things really. So one is the quantum of change happening simultaneously, and the other is the pace of change across so many different fronts at one time. And I think that's the key thing of why we can lean into this time now to think about how sustainability and sustainability thinking and the mindset and the leadership that goes to creating the transformations that we need to see, why that's so critically important at this time. And if we go to the next slide, what we see is this sense of these global megatrends operating across, as I say, a range of different fronts simultaneously, deep, impactful change. That each year the World Economic Forum collates these changes and identifies them as risks. And I think if we take the next slide, it shows you the number of risks emerging over these next 10 years. And I think, irrespective of the detail here, I think if you can just see, the green dots are where environment is really presenting a major risk. And this is a risk to long-term economic outcomes, but also humanitarian outcomes. And then you look at a whole suite of risks around the economy, shown up in blue. You look at yellow for geopolitical challenges, orange, the societal challenges, and then purple, the technological challenges. So I think it just goes to show the quantum of risk, the different facets of change that are happening and playing out globally. And then if you go to the next slide.
Oh, can I say a point on that last point? Go back for a second, Ellen. So I've been tracking these, as Wendy has, for a number of years. And what we've seen, these are annual reports put out by the World Economic Forum and asking world leaders, mostly corporate leaders, and now they've expanded this. And up until the last few years, you did not see many green topics on this. And this has been a major transformation of how these leaders, the corporate leaders, civic leaders, are now recognizing the fragility of our ecosystems. And you see them understanding this, climate change, extreme weather events, even water crisis. In a way, it's both human driven as well as nature, right? So that could be green as well as it is red. So these are dominating the concerns of leaders around, business leaders. Thanks. That's the point I wanted to.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's absolutely right. And I think into this mix, we're adding, a global pandemic, which is not only, a kind of risk in itself, but I think it's also accelerating many of the underlying risks, whether it's around social unrest and inequity, whether it's about technological adoption. Actually, there's been a real digital revolution in the last kind of six, 7 months. And so if we go to the next slide, what this is creating, it's creating a situation, I think as Jack said, where leaders not only need to understand the balance sheet, but they also need to understand the planet. So they're working in situations which are characterized by very high degrees of so-called VUCA conditions. So this is volatility, it's uncertainty, it's complexity, it's ambiguity. So the leadership space around sustainability is very much how are leaders able to hold uncertainty? How are they able to navigate through this complexity and make decisions in conditions defined with very high levels of ambiguity? And this is calling on leaders who are maybe before managing inside the firm or inside the organization, inside the business, inside a university construct, but now leaders are very much managing risk which is not within their control. It's many risks which are presented outside the business, outside the institution. And so these VUCA conditions are demanding and calling for, I think, a very different kind of leadership construct as we lead through and deliver against the Sustainable Development Goals, but also deliver around sustainability. So I think, Jack, you're going to take us on through those.
Yes, just on that point, Wendy and I have been interviewing various leaders in the auto industry and elsewhere, and we hear refrains that I think comes back in this phrase. They were now forced to manage in a fog. There was no playbook. There was they didn't know what directionality, particularly where governments were failing to offer that directionality, as it was true in the US. And so they were very much in the midst of this VUCA situation, and still are in some cases with our COVID crisis. Next slide.
One of my CEOs just described it as VUCA on speed now. So taking VUCA to the next level. Yeah.
So, I like this series of images, and I'll tell you why. Because to me, this reflects the rise of a global consciousness, right? And so our common future, commissioned by the United Nations, led by Gro Brundtland. She's a physician. She graduated with a degree in public health from Harvard School, my institution. Prime Minister at a very young age of Norway, put in the first carbon tax on the oil and gas coming in off her coast. Was beset by the industry, but she held firm to build sovereign funds for the future, rather than just deplete the resource. So she is just a strong woman and just a gifted leader. And then went on to be the head of the World Health Organization. But the beginning of a change of consciousness, it comes out with a document like this, Our Common Future. And Wendy already said what the key line was about not depleting our resources currently so that future generations would have the same benefits, the same possibilities that we do. But then you see this played out, and that was document led to this first Earth Summit, Rio in 92, that brought together NGOs, civic leaders, companies to really start to address the issues that were confronting the Earth in climate change. So think how long in the past that this started, that people recognized this. And then Johannesburg was supposed to be a 10-year checkup on that first Rio conference. And then it became very clear, and the conflicts were very present at Johannesburg. You can't have economic development that would benefit the poor, the underserved, the undernourished, and also go after climate. That was what the climate deniers were sort of forcing people to choose between the two. Do you want benefits for the rest of the world population, or do you want to drive climate change for, and so that was played out over a series of years leading up to Rio plus 20 that was followed. So that's some of the background of the growing consciousness, and that out of that came the Kyoto Accords, and eventually came the Paris Agreement in 2015, before we got the Paris Agreement. And now we have to hold nations to those agreements. Next slide, please. So in that process, after Johannesburg and somewhere leading up to Rio 2, the UN and the World Health Organization started to develop the Millennium Development Goals. And these were goals to end poverty, to end malnutrition, to have more equitable health care for peoples in the world. And it really did not catch on. I mean, and one can point to lots of places where it fell way short. So in the development of the Sustainable Development Goals, they recognized those mistakes. They didn't include the private sector. They didn't include other ministries beyond the ministries of health. You know, it's in finance, you know, in industry, commerce, labor, you had to bring these other ministries. So the effort wasn't solely the responsibility for different nations' ministers of health. That's where the Millennium Development Goals fell short. They asked one agency to take the lead effectively on these things. But now we have these were well debated, and they brought in a wide sector of stakeholders into the formulation. And this was brilliantly done, because behind each one of these panels is a series of very specific targets. In fact, some 100, almost 170 targets. I suggest you look at these things. And I also say they put out an annual report, the World Health Organization, or UN, excuse me, UN puts this out, that says how well we're doing against these goals. Next slide, please. I particularly like the way the Stockholm Resilience Center restructures or re-expresses these 17 Sustainable Development Goals, because they put on the base, they put the ecosystems, climate, biodiversity, soils, ocean life, you know, feedstocks of these are fundamental bedrock for everything else that happens in society. And I think the way they've expressed it here, it relates, I think, is very appealing. And it says where we really cannot fail. Then you have the social goals, the human rights, the culture, the education of women. And then you have the other things that are more driven by the economic opportunities, the building of renewable resources, the improvement of our urban life and our rural communities. So this is a different way to express in order the Sustainable Development Goals. Next slide, please. I think the other thing they said, that the thing about this that is unique, is they use symbols. They really have, I mean, even this pin that they have given out to people around the world is symbolic of those 17 goals, targets in the Sustainable Development Goals. So they did a very strategic marketing strategy, which is really important if you're going to change people's minds and interest. I like this because reading some of the early work coming out of the UN, different commissions along the way, they recognized that we were on the wrong pathway. So out of the Rio meetings where people said, listen, we got to move forward. And we started to see NGOs primarily set up guidance, instructions, constructs to raise the consciousness within corporations and with in civic society. And it's expressed by these three circles in the middle of this figure, the three stools upon which economy, three legs of a stool upon which society stands: strong economic, social, and environmental concerns. But if you look at this symbolically, the sustainability is the intersection, the smallest little intersection. And that's why I like the Stockholm expression. These are interfolded and not to be thought of as three separate things. But then you had coming out of this, the Global Reporting Initiative that came out of an NGO and adopted by thousands of companies around the world, where they report annually and produce a report on their governance, their social and environmental governance of their companies. And what they did was it focused on waste. Let's do better next year by doing less bad. Let's reduce our energy. Let's reduce our waste flow. Let's slowly improve things. And it turns out that hasn't been enough. Nature tells us that's not enough. So the rethinking here is to think about this as assets. What do we want to build within our society or our companies or our towns or our cities? We want to have manufactured capital, the physical infrastructure. We want to build our natural capital. These are assets that we want to build in time and not necessarily and cover our depleted losses by a regenerative process. We want to build human capital. That's health. That's education of our population. The social capital, the values, the norms, the trust in institutions, which we know too well how fragile these can be if misapplied. We see it in our particular society being played out over the big drama, what's happened and culminated in our last election, is breaking of norms and breaking of good institutional structures and trust. And we want to build knowledge, right? These are how strong is your country in its patents, its innovation, in its knowledge base, all right? So these are really important things to think about as a reframing of sustainability. Next slide. And in this book I recommend that to all to really see how this is laid out in some detail. Wendy?
Yeah, so I think, when we look at the SDGs and we look at the kind of a linear set of 17 different tiles, I think to look at them in that nested way that Jack described of, the biosphere, society and economy, I think is really important to see the connections. And I think this was a really nice piece of work that was done by UN DESA, where they actually took each of the individual goals with the underlying targets and just showed how hyper-connected and interdependent they are. So that if you look at investing in education, how that contributes to women's empowerment, how it contributes to bringing people out of poverty, how it contributes to innovation in society. So they mapped very carefully this sense of this suite of 17 goals. They are interconnected, they are hyper dependent. There is a real sense, if you look at them, that you can think about the investment in one area shows up in impact and outcomes in other areas. And I think that's a really interesting kind of mind map to take those 17 tiles, think about the nested nature of them, think about the connections among them. And so at this point, we wanted to invite you to give us some sense of, next slide, please. What is it that sustainability means for you? And we've highlighted a couple of sustainability issues. Obviously, there are lots to choose from. And so we're going to go into a polling which is to think about, of all the different sustainability issues, and we've selected, I think, 10 here. Tell us, where your thinking is sitting around what does sustainability mean for you? What are you most concerned with? So if we can invite you to complete this poll, and then our team at Eon Collective will give us some feedback on where your thinking sits.
So to be clear, someone can click on the one
Yes.
that and they have to make a choice, right? So what becomes important for you?
Exactly.
Wonder if I can do it.
And you can make a number of choices.
Oh, you can. Okay.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, you can. Yeah.
So you can make your choices and submit, and then we'll get a little poll showing us the results of that. So as I say, there are a whole suite of different things that we can look at, but these tend to be the ones that really come through in different societies and different surveys. So do we have some polling to share?
I'll just give it another few seconds.
Another second.
Not everyone, so I encourage everyone to select the.
Just gives us a window on where people are thinking now, and interesting. So pollution and climate change out there right in the front, but actually then water, clearly, poverty, and then waste smattering across all the others. Very interesting. Thank you very much. Jack, is anything you wanted to? Oh, let's go. So I think we'll move on, and I know we have to move at pace now because we have about 15 minutes or so just to introduce you to some other themes. So this is, Jack, did you want to pick up on this convergence and just step through?
Yeah, so I appreciate the time. So we're going to, I think let's just, I think this is highlighted, these issues are highlighted in the next series of slides, please. And I don't, so I'm going to share this with you. I'm just going to pick out some highlights. I mean, we can easily become overwhelmed with the direness of the changes that we're seeing around our world, suffering of collapse of coral reefs, the slowing down of the mid-Atlantic circulation gyre, right? We're seeing this over time. The massive loss of glacier water off of Greenland, and then certainly all the glaciers around the world. We see this evidence. So sometimes when I go through these kinds of, let's say, global updates, I depress myself. And there's a fine line besides we got to be aware of these things because they are critically close to the tipping points. There's a recent scientific article that says there are 9 major tipping points, and 4 or 5 out of those 9 are very close to putting us into the Anthropocene. So the Earth and nature will continue. It'll just find another set point, as it has over the millions and millions of years of the history of the Earth. We've had glacial periods and interglacial periods. We've had warm tropical. Why do you think they're finding oil in the Bering Sea? Why do you think finding oil off of Siberia, right? Major exploration, because that had been so intensely tropical at one time. And the permafrost is essentially peat. It's vegetation that is in a solid form of ice. So these are the things that are projected to happen as the Earth warms. So it's not just sea level rise, it's a whole cascade of issues. droughts being one projected into the future. Next slide, please. And then if you look at biodiversity or loss of biodiversity, and so it's not only the complete collapse of species, it's the thinning of the species. There was a recent interview of an author, naturalist out of the UK, who remembered as a youth the moth blizzard. So maybe this isn't appropriate for Saudi Arabia, but many places our windshields at night would be covered with bugs that would hit it. And after he said, this doesn't happen much anymore. So there's a massive thinning of the species, not just a collapse, but a thinning of the species. And this has obviously great concern. And then when we talk about what the implication to agriculture is that some plants, many of the basic food stocks of the world, don't do well under high temperatures. They lose nutrient value. They may survive, they may not, but they won't be as productive, and they lose some of their nutrient value because of this. So there's some real implications of this. And we already see that 50 million kids under 5 are undernourished and have stunted growth around the world. So we already have a dire situation that the stress of temperature and drought make it worse. Next slide, please. And you can look at some of these factors. The income gap. So as I pointed out in the Sustainable Development Goals, one of the things that was important to this is an annual reporting, a tracking of how well we're doing against these 17 different goals. And if you look at some of those early reports, 2016, 2017, 2018, 19, we're starting to make some real progress on poverty. The number of people that were below, that had gotten out of this very subsistence living, $1 to $2 a day, had, for the first time ever, got below, since they tracked this stuff, got below 1 billion people. And now with COVID and the collapse of economies in many countries, we're seeing retrenchment here. We're seeing people slide back into poverty. So this came along just at the time where some hopefulness was occurring, that we're having inroads into, because of better education, because of economic opportunities, people were coming out of poverty at a faster rate than they were going into it. Next slide. So we got to pay attention to this in the 2000, I don't think the 20 report's out yet, but certainly the 2021 report that comes out early next year from the UN, we have to pay attention to. And now, of course, we know this pandemics. So I think, Wendy, you were responsible for finding this image of the preparedness in 2017. How wrong is that picture? That picture is really wrong, because you look at, you would suggest that the countries in the lightest color are best prepared for a pandemic. And it turns out that wasn't the case. Maybe it was our hubris that we could do this. But I think on every turn of the events, the failure was in the body politics in many cases. The countries that have had greater success, even though it came first in China, recognized in China, they have really cut down on their cases. I think they've gone multiple days without new cases. And good success in New Zealand, good success in Korea as well, in Japan, but some retrenchment, but nothing to what we're seeing in Northern Europe and the United States. And that's too bad, because we know that things work. And again, so we're facing a situation of a vaccine on the horizon. And this goes back to some of the capitals, right? Social capital. So I asked my class a couple months ago, I said, all right, there must be, if a vaccine's available, would you take it? Half of them said no. I mean, these are smart people, right? Half of them said no, they wouldn't take it. So we got into a discussion about this because they didn't have trust in the system. They didn't have trust that this was thoroughly vetted as it was in the past. We used to have great trust in the World Health Organization, in our Food and Drug Administration, in our Centers for Disease Control. And that makes a difference. So when you have failures to address the pandemic, you have to go back to what the systemic reasons might be. Failure of our institutions and our leadership. Next slide. And I think I will get off my small soapbox there. So I want to get back to how we have rethought what we were doing. Even at a school of public health, when you think about it, research within a academic institution like Harvard or any other, research university, the reward system is pretty much predicated on your publications, right? Your research, your grant getting. And we said this is not what society needs or should expect from us as academics. We're not separate from society. So when I had a chance to be the director of the Center for Health and the Global Environment, I gathered my like-minded faculty, I gathered my students, I gathered people like Wendy to come over and spend some time with us. Little did she know it would end up being 5 years. But we said, listen, we're going to do this differently. We're only providing evidence, and we got to scale that evidence, and we can't scale it alone. We have to change the practice. And Holly, you know this quite well because that's what I was doing by teaching in the night school, right? You were out there changing the world, and you needed other skills to help you do that, right? So this is what gave us purpose as we went through this. So we called it a radical collaborations. Next slide will show you what I mean by that. Now, this must fool you by showing a picture of these smiling people with their instruments. But many of you know Yo-Yo Ma, the famous cellist. And years ago, he set up the Silk Road Ensemble. And the Silk Road Ensemble is a collection of the world genre of music, Indian music, African rhythms, folk music, jazz, the cacophony of sounds that are created by different cultures around the world. And he put this together and he called it, this is a radical collaboration. And I thought that this term spoke so well to what we needed to do to step forward and saying that we in academics have to collaborate to be effective. The next slide is just a indication of that. So when I was the director of the center, and actually even before that, we started working with good companies that really cared about what they did for their people, their products serving society, what they did for the environment, so they had good stewardship. And through this process, and you just see a few of them through the symbols, we were able to magnify our impact because they could take what we were doing as building the evidence and create products out of this or evaluate the benefits of their products to society. And one thing I'll mention here is way down in the corner is UBS, a big financial organization. And we work with them with the diagram up in the upper corner, PGGM. PGGM is a pension fund, a Dutch pension fund made up of healthcare workers, doctors and nurses. And they said they wanted their pension fund to do good for society. So the question is, if you have tradable commodities or you have stocks in your portfolio of publicly traded institutions, how do you know they're doing any good, right? Are they really making a positive benefit to society? So it wasn't just they were doing less bad. We set out to quantify how much good they were doing. And so this led, now, I never would have thought from School of Public Health that I'd be working with financial institutions, but we made our mark in leading a way forward of how to change the paradigm of how do we value corporations in society. Next slide, and I think this is,
yeah.
you take over.
So I know we're running a little long, so I will pace through this quite quickly, but really just to take up this next section, which is, okay, we see the crisis, we see the existential threats coming towards us, or we're actually living through them now. How do we connect up our institutions as leaders to do something about this? So really very much to get into some of the sustainability leadership, and if we can take the next slide. And as I mentioned earlier, we're finding very much that leaders need to be able to, yes, of course, read the balance sheet, but they need to be able to read the planet. They need to be able to navigate this fog that Jack talked about in these VUCA conditions. They need to be able to recognize that the quantum and pace of change is influencing their organizations in profound ways. And they need to transform. They need to transform those organizations. Next slide, please. So when we look and we talk, I think there's a whole body of work around organizational change, and they talk about organizational change at a kind of macro level. But I think what's really clear is organizations don't change. They don't change. It's the people within those organizations that change. It's the individual acts day to day, what we call culture, in the sense of how people speak and act and prioritize in the incentives that they follow, and the kind of a whole sense of how do we influence at level of the person such that at the collective there is a shift. And I think next slide, the famous business strategist Drucker talked about, this sense of culture, how people act, behave, how they speak, how they create incentives which are compatible to strategy. This is where change really happens. And without that sense of culture, strategy just gets eaten for breakfast, is the famous quote. So you can't set out a strategic agenda around sustainability without paying all due attention to how people are behaving within that sense. And particularly leaders, the shadow of a leader on an organization is quite profound, as well as the individual self-leadership. And so next slide, please. What we're finding from our work, particularly with global CEOs, is how they're leading in this space of VUCA, framed by the Sustainable Development Goals and Sustainable Development, is they are fundamentally shifting their leadership attributes, behaviors, and styles. They're managing less, they're leading more. They're not using communication as a broadcast tool, they're using communication to dialogue with people. They're thinking about how do they break down some of the hierarchy and the silos, how do they invest in networks. And they're talking a lot less actually about strategy and a much more about the purpose, the change that they want to see in the society, and very much putting this sense of profit with purpose. So this sense of doing good for people and for planet. So next slide. So the fundamentals here are, it starts with understanding self and recognizing that I am the instrument through which I make a difference as a leader. And we were interested in this next poll, if we can maybe run it quickly and I'll talk on, about where you're sitting in terms of your own sustainability thinking. Are you really at that point of being a passionate advocate and maybe activist? Are you informed or vaguely aware? Or are you still maybe sitting as relatively cynical that any of this stuff will make some difference? So we'll let you complete that slide and we'll put the results up in a moment. But if I can just push the slide deck along to the next slide, is that possible? Oh, no, go back one, please. That's it. So the fundamentals are that if we pick up around sustainable self, and if we connect the work that we do within our families, within our organizations, it's wonderful to be surrounded by
That's
cohort.
fantastic.
Passionate, 100% advocates. Thank you very much. We are speaking to the converted, so I'm looking forward to our discussions in a moment. So thank you for that. So it is creating this connection that these individual personal actions are connected to a broader global collective, so that we can recognize the work we do within our families, within our communities, within our nations are actually connected to the broader construct of what's happening at global and at our planet. So there's this whole sense of being locally rooted but globally connected. And I think that's a really powerful construct. If we move through to the next slide around how do we take this awakening, how do we take this passion and actually create business value? And this is value for society at large to deliver against some of those sustainable development goals. So next slide. This takes us on a journey through sustainability, and I think it's, you know, start where you are is the wise kind of advice. Is start where you are. It might be as simple as reducing waste and thinking about de-risking. It might be all the way through to differentiating the business or the institution on the basis of how you're engaging around sustainability. Or it might be somewhere between those two spaces around how you're optimizing your services, your products, how you're integrating this into the corporate strategy. So there is a place to start wherever you are on this journey towards sustainability. Next slide, please. So the arguments around why are really clear. So having false dichotomies between profits versus sustainability is old thinking. New thinking positions sustainability as the powerhouse for innovation. It's a both and agenda. It's doing not less bad, but doing well and doing good. And I think that's the new architecture of thinking. It's this both and agenda. So next slide, what we're seeing is this repositioning of sustainability as a strategic corporate agenda. And I think a profound kind of part of the movement that Jack talked about, you know, whether it's way back in Rio or the Climate Accord, is last year when a group of global CEOs signed to say we exist not as simply to serve our shareholders, but we exist to deliver benefits to all our stakeholders. So this was moving from the purpose of a company vehicle to maximize profits to the purpose being maximizing value. And this was a really important redefinition through the Business Roundtable of what a corporate entity was about. And I think if we can take that into our final few slides, we're now working, if I can take the next slide, please. So we're now working with a whole suite of global leaders around a piece of research we're calling Leaders on Purpose, where we're really looking at the whole new way in which sustainability thinking is actually showing up within business in particular, and it's moving it from a kind of discretionary activity that runs alongside in the doing less bad column to it moving it mainstream to making it this both and framing, or some people are calling it and framing, and thinking about purpose as being maximizing value for shareholders, recognizing the fragility of our planet, and embracing sustainability at a very much a strategic level. So just to give you a window on a report we will publish later on next month, next slide, some of the things that our leaders are telling us about this reframing of sustainability is how it's helping them navigate uncertainty, how they're able to move through these VUCA times, but using purpose embedded within sustainability, how they're thinking about integrating profit and purpose. So being very deliberate, being very conscious about the decisions that they're making to create value. How this is changing leadership fundamentally to become much more human-centered, thinking less of the machine and the old management tools, and actually recognizing the unique contribution and creativity of individuals, how you can empower people to be their best selves, how you can put equity as the key lens through which you lead, and recognizing how leaders influence followers by the way they show up, how they set the tone, how they can be humble to learn from others and recognize their contribution in a wider ecosystem of multi-actor stakeholders that hold up societal progress. So just to finish up, we wanted to introduce on our next slide some of the work we're doing. We mentioned at the top of the talk with the auto industry, but we're using a culture of health as a framework for sustainability thinking. This is a piece of research that's joint between the T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Business School, and recognizing, as John Quelch says, that every company, knowing or unknowingly, is impacting on human health. And I think we saw those macro statistics around climate change, around food insecurity, around poverty, around pandemics. So in our next slide, we break out sustainability around these culture of health domains into 4 spaces. Environment, we've talked about. Community, how the business is impacting on the health of its communities that it serves, its employees, including the supply chain, and its consumers. And we're looking at the culture of health as a new way in which to think about how sustainability can influence our thinking across those 4 domains. And I'll just, on our next slide, introduce you to a massive open online course, a so-called MOOC, that the team developed, which is freely available to undertake this deep learning experience through the edX platform. So we've included the details in there. So just to conclude, if we take our next slide, the premise I think that we're adopting is that you can do good for your organization, do good for the planet, this both and or and framing. And the recognition, as we saw, I think, in those nested SDGs, that, you know, you can't have a healthy society or a healthy organization on a dead planet. You know, there is a real sense that these are connected to the health and well-being of society at large. And then our next slide, please. It's also to kind of be very hard-nosed about this too, is to recognize that this fundamental transformation that we're talking about is an enormous investment opportunity. And I think people were very clear that in this pandemic, as we've seen investments by governments, the sense of stimulus packages or packages that support and hold this pause that we've taken globally, I think, as from lockdown and everything else with the pandemic. We have spent vast amounts of money during this period. Actually, we've spent more than we need over this pandemic than we really need to deliver against the SDGs fully. So how can we capture this collective sense of urgency to now invest in delivering against the SDGs? So to finish up, we really want to recognize that sustainability is very much around value creation. It's how we connect that strategy with goals, how we integrate this into our thinking. And then just to finish, we wanted to identify, next slide, please, a suite of future directions. I think we are content that we can mobilize the resource. I think we are holding collectively an accountability, but where there is enormous opportunity is to now invest in creativity and building capacity. So that's around education, that's around scaling the solutions that are in this space. It's around really engaging stakeholders and the public. So I'll hand back to Jack after that pretty quick romp through a vast amount of our research programming.
Yeah, so let me just conclude. I want to show Holly her alma mater again. So, you know, very much in the sense of democratizing education. You said it really well, Wendy. I mean, this has to be a way forward. People have to have a consciousness raising, but they also have skill sets to make a difference. And so we had the opportunity to do this through the Harvard Division of Continuing Education that brought forth in courses in eco-design, in health in the built environment, life cycle analysis, innovation and technology, carbon accounting, environmental reporting and social reporting. So we ran a whole host of programs so that they were available to people throughout the world. You didn't have to be accepted to Harvard undergrad or our school system or our graduate schools to have access to this knowledge. In fact, one of the courses that we're teaching, we have people that are up in the middle of the night from India, from Australia, to take our courses that we offer at night. It's just the whole world is gathering now online. And this is to create let's say a legion, not just of leaders. I think we look to leaders as the solution, but we need educated followers. We need influencers. We need people with skill sets who can affect change in themselves and others. So so I think that is a perspective that we've taken on more recently. So last slide here. I think, this just refers to a program that we just celebrated, and that was our work on Gulf sustainable urbanism. And, you know, thinking this was a research that took these 10 cities that shared the Gulf region and looked at them from their past settlements up to the modern states that they are in, and started to identify the challenges that they go forward with. So I just submit that as some background that you certainly could think about, because what I was seeing in this process is that we were looking at populations that had ancient wisdom, that had known how to deal in a very challenging climate, and yet built their architectural forms to be sustainable under that context. And then they modernize. So the question is, does the modern state have the same resilience that the earlier states had? Of course, this is highly glossed over. There were all sorts of issues that, of course, that were of great concern for public health back then and for other things. But it really is a point in time to be reflective of the past and saying, what is it that we want to build forward in our future? So with that, next slide, we will thank you for your attention and look forward to discussion. So Ellen, thanks for advancing the slides. I think you were doing that, and Holly for introducing us and organizing and making this happen. You didn't organize it, but made it happen.
Thanks, Jack. Thank you, Wendy. That was wonderful. That's very inspiring to get to have this time with you all. And we have a really great question for you to have a little think about and a brief answer before we go to the next section of our event. So I'm just going to read this. It's from Diana Sagantini, who asks, first of all, she thanks you for your presentation. and her question to you both is on the social component of sustainability, i.e. values, institutions, trust, etc. Do you think this component is taken into consideration enough, or will it weigh more in these complex times? Can you think about a global role model that should unite us more around this concept? And Diana says, shukran. Thank you.
Lots of ideas floating in my head, but Wendy, you take this.
We do a lot of work around how leaders create trust, and I think there's some really great data that's collected every year under the Edelman Trust Barometer, where they look at public confidence and trust actually in a whole suite of institutions. And I think you can see over time some quite profound changes as people lose trust in governments of different denominations and in different countries. And over this period of the pandemic, we've seen trust in universities go up as they've been seen as part of the solution to the science and the vaccines and the other things. So you've seen trust in the media actually go down as we've had this whole rhetoric around fake news, and people have become siloed in their news feed. So I think the idea of competency, ethics, and trust are profound enablers of the kind of transformation that we're trying to see, because leaders are trying to really in this space, they're trying to take you from the now and bridge you to this unknown future. So you're not going to follow somebody across to an unknown destination unless there is a fundamental trust there in those leaders. And I think that's something that, in terms of the enabling around sustainability, I think we can be confident about the technological solutions, but I think these societal, as the questioner said, these societal issues of how can we build trust to take this leap into this unknown future is really where we need to do a lot of work, both institutions and with leaders. That gives you some thinking time.
So I'm going to prompt you to say more to answer that question. You've asked to talk about the Greta effect, and we see social movements in all sorts of scales and forms. Google workers walking off their jobs because of social discord within their corporate leaders. One would think that could be more accountability to the future, and we starting to see the power of that, and I think fostered by media and social media, I would say, that can quickly gather like-minded individuals that say we share a common value. And that's happening quickly.
Yeah, and just add to that one of the things that really destroys trust is around inequity. So where there are these polarizations, whether it's around wealth, whether it's around health, these polarizations really destroy trust in institutions in particular. So I think that's something that we should be aware of.
Thank you, Dr. Wendy. Thank you, Jack. Before we break, we have another expert guest joining us for a brief response. So I'm going to take this moment to introduce Abdurrahman Alsam, who is Director of Sustainability at Madden. He's also the author of The Sustainability Paradox, The Way Out, which is available on Amazon, and you can read his entire bio on our website as well. So I welcome Abdurrahman to make his comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk and to be part of this panel, sharing this panel with the great professors. Unfortunately, my few minutes will be talking about a very narrow and deep perspective I'm not going to talk about the SDGs or sustainability concepts in general, but I will talk about the extractive business as I just departed. By the way, I'm not a director in Ma'aden anymore. That was a history a few months ago. So, but I enjoyed definitely working in mining for quite a long time. Actually, when I did my post-grad diploma in international environmental law, my final essay was about how can I use the public diplomacy and the stakeholder engagement to inform policy change. And that was back in 2010. And at that time, I was working in an aerospace company. And I thought there's no way that I can really use these skills or this knowledge in the Saudi context. And when I joined the extractive business, when I joined the mining company specifically, it proves me wrong. And actually, it has huge space in Saudi context to use the stakeholder engagement and public diplomacy, not only to change the policies, but also to make the change in reality. So what I'm trying to talk about in this few minutes is how does it look like health-wise, as the two professors talk about the four elements or the four perspectives of the business impact on health, which is the employee, community, consumers, and environment. But before that, in my paper, and I hope sometime they will share it with you, I was talking about first about the occupational health and the unspoken sorrow, because the occupational health profession is actually underestimated. At least this is my own view, especially in extractive business and industry in general, not in food industry maybe, but in other industries, but also in extractive. So for the occupational health professionals, COVID-19 is actually a kind of I don't want to say good news, but an opportunity to show their return on investment to the business, to show them that it's not about the injuries, but it's also about the long-term impact on people's life. And being a sustainability professional, it's a pursuit of finding your sweet spot in the middle between the deeply rooted and rational business as usual mentality in one side, and in the other side is the glamorous of the great-hearted activism. So as a professional, sustainability professional, you need to be somewhere in the middle. You need to find your middle first, because it's very relative from sector to sector, from person to person. And then you need to juggle these two concepts in your head all the time to make sense of what you're saying to the business leaders. And to give you that sense, I would like, before I start talking about the bad impact of the extractive on human health, I would like to tell you or to inform you more about the extractive business as a great, I should say, a platform for civilization. The humankind is actually, as we consider humankind as gatherer and hunter in one time, and then cultivators and agri workers in other time, the human is actually extractors since the ancient Bronze Age. We are extracting resources and minerals, and that is a turning point, if not a tipping point, for civilization to pick up and to transit the humanity progress. So, and you will still do the same thing in every industrial revolution or in every human revolution. Extraction and mineralization is a major point in this civilization. If you want to talk about the AI now, if you want to talk about the modern energy and the green energy, it's heavily dependent on minerals as well. And go to future, if you are talking about the space mining and getting resources from space, again, it's mines. So it drives me to think that extraction is one of the human instincts, not only practice. This is how deeply it is. And it goes back all the way, even before the ancient Egypt, as the picture here in front of you. There is also the prehistory of humanity starting the mining. And in Saudi Arabia, by the way, we to far degree claim that one of the ancient sites here is actually Bahd al-Dhahab, which is the cradle of gold, that we track its history back to King Solomon or Nabi Sulaiman alayhi salam. So to give you some information about extractive business, I know it doesn't really enjoy a good reputation. Oil, gas, mining, all of them, they do not. And part of that is not only the business itself, but this relationship between the minerals and wealth and power that really gives this industry a bad reputation. Part of it also the invasion of the north on south on the earth. So it's very contextual more than fact-based. If we go to the facts, we will find that 3.5 billion of people are actually living in 80 countries that depends on the extractive business for their economies. Okay, they are giving me note that we need to wrap up. Let me give you very quickly the impact of this extractive business on human health. If we look to the employee, I know that usually the normal narrative is all about respiratory risk, illness risks, and maybe halves and all other obvious things. But there is an impact that nobody's really talking about that much in extractive business, which is the mental health that caused by the remoteness and working in remote areas, and the social fitness issues. And those are health issues connected to people who working and employees working in remote areas. When it comes to the community, it's very obvious talking about dust and the climate change effects. However, there is another perspective of that that we need to take in consideration, which is the lack of engagement with people, because the majority of the health risks to the community is generated from less engagement, less information to the community about what's happening in the site, and that could drive some of the placebo effects to the community at some point. Consumers, the mining is actually impacting consumers specifically through the fertilizers and through the food and fertilizers. And environment at the end, the climate change is impacting our environment, and oil and gas is definitely contributing a lot, while, by the way, mining is contributing less than 5% to the CO2. The answer is in the business model. I don't have enough time to talk about that, but if anyone interested, I can answer that later. Thank you very much, and sorry if I exceed my time.
Thank you so much, Abdul Rahman. We look forward to asking you about some of the local challenges and opportunities after our break. We are just at almost at the half hour now. So we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we'll be coming back after that. So we look forward to moving on to Chatham House Rules after the break, where it will no longer be a live stream, but just a smaller group of guests who can engage a little more directly